As we mentioned last week, we are living in truly extraordinary times. Even in this small congregation, we have been adversely affected. We are in the fourth week of a stay-at-home mandate, and this is the second week in which I find myself literally preaching to empty pews. While we are all undoubtedly feeling the results of the outbreak of COVID-19, it has been an even longer and more difficult struggle for larger bodies, for other states, and for other nations. The coronavirus has been reported in all 50 of these United States and nearly all 200 of the world's nations. Due to the outbreak, we and many others find ourselves under the equivalent of house arrest. Though we have committed no crime and been convicted of sin, our lives have become lives of confinement. We have been quarantined to prevent the crime of catching or spreading illness. Sadly, it's not the first time mankind has been forced to face potentially deadly disease. Beginning in 1338, the world was subjected to its second and its most serious bout with a particular plague, which has since been named the Black Death. From Sicily, the Black Death took only 3 years to sweep entirely through Europe, traveling as far north as Iceland and Greenland. In its wake, 25 to 60% of the European population was decimated. While exact numbers are hard to put together because of the medieval records, it is estimated that the plague took between 75 and 200 million lives. Needless to say, many thought then, as many think in the 21st century, the plague was the end of the world. And while the plague is recorded as having run its course by 1351, Europe saw additional outbreaks of the same disease every few years over the next few centuries. That plague was bacterial rather than viral, but it was just as hideous. It came in 3 forms, the least of which was the bubonic plague, which is most closely affiliated with the Black Death. It killed only 30 to 75% of those affected. The pneumonic plague from the same bacteria was more deadly. It killed nearly 90 to 95% of its victims. And the most deadly of all was the septicemic plague from the same bacteria. It was almost always fatal, killing nearly 100% of those who contracted it. Then as now, the church was also adversely affected by the plague. Gerardo, brother of the famous humanist Petrarch and a monk in the monastery of Montreux, was the only survivor of the plague in the monastery, along with his dog. He buried the other 34 monks himself. Of 140 Dominican brothers in Montpelier, only 7 survived the Black Death. And it's easy to see why most people were deathly afraid of what they simply referred to as the Great Mortality. In the 1890s, over 1,300 years after the first pandemic and 500 years after the European decimation, a third major outbreak of the same plague erupted in China and India, eventually reaching the United States, with infections being especially dangerous in the San Francisco Bay Area. Fortunately, it was during this third outbreak that the real cause was discovered. And with the cause came cure. For over 1,300 years, the world faced a plague without a viable cure. During that time, various theories and practices sprang up to stop or at least hinder the plague. Many doctors believed that bad smells could drive out the plague. And so as a result, some of the treatment of the disease included dung and urine. Aren't you glad our government has not come to those conclusions just yet? Needless to say, those solutions were more likely to spread disease than they were to cure it. But during the Middle Ages also, the masses tried several different ways to cure the plague. They tried to be happy and avoid thinking bad thoughts. They tried to drink only good wine. They tried to avoid eating fruit. They tried putting fragrant herbs in their beverages. They tried to avoid lechery. They tried to not abuse the poor. And they tried to eat and drink only in moderation. And they did not bathe, because not only was it considered a sign of vanity, which would evoke God's wrath, it was also thought that the hot water would open the pores and let the bad air in. Since even the cloistered communities were not exempt from the plague. Many believed that the plague was God's wrath poured out on a sinful world. Others believed it was the unfavorable alignment of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars. It's impossible to say how many other outlandish theories were unleashed at the time. But we must remember that while there are cures today, there were no real cures in the 14 centuries during which the Black Plague would occasionally rear its head. But to this day, no one knows what repeatedly stopped the plague. Strangely, the plague, when it appeared, always maintained a fatality rate of between 30 and 90% of those who were infected, and yet it was always stopped before the eradication of man. It sounds a lot like the unknowns of COVID-19 we're facing today. But what we tend to overlook is that the plague continues to survive even in the modern world of the 21st century. There are still focal points of the plague throughout the world. In Asia, in Russia, and even the American Southwest. But fortunately today, because of our antibiotics, the plague is rarely fatal. And so today we must count ourselves fortunate that even in those cities, states, and nations most plagued with COVID-19, we have not been subjected to the catastrophic fatality rates of those during the Great Mortality. And yet even so, we find ourselves fearful of what might happen, of where this might lead, of how our lives might be permanently changed. And it's our fears which paralyze us, lock us behind closed doors, and drive us away from our fellow man. You know, it's appropriate to talk about COVID-19 on Easter. Because for many of us, we want a resurrection. We want to feel like we've come back to life. We want to feel like life has begun again and gotten back to where it needs to be. Nearly 2,000 years ago, 500 years before the first outbreak of the Black Death, another group faced exactly that same kind of fear and those same questions. Their lives had been shattered. Their faith had been tested. They did not know where to turn. They had no one in whom they felt they could trust, and they did not know how much their lives would change. Their infection was much more deadly, for it was an infection with the potential to lead to eternal death, not merely physical. This morning, we're going to look for their answers rather than those which answer COVID-19. For the answers of that small group are the same answers which will propel us through even our current crisis with a hope in the future. This morning, we look back to their answers to overcoming fear. And to overcome our fears, we must understand several things about fear. First, fear is paralyzing in the face of the unknown. You know, the primary concern after the infectious nature of COVID-19 itself is, will our lives ever get back to normal? Or is this going to scar us forever? Is this going to leave us in some permanent state of flux and change our lives? You know, the doomsayers are already loudly contending that we are going to enter a new era. It's an era when man will no longer work shoulder to shoulder with his brothers. It's an era when man will be forced to wear a mask and gloves whenever he goes into his community. It's an era when nothing will return to what it was. That was not the case in Europe in the midst of the worst plague mankind has ever seen or known. Nor does it have to be that case in the face of COVID-19. If history teaches us anything, it teaches us that there is hope, even in the light of a pandemic. We've already said that the Black Death stopped its rampage across Europe. No one knows why, but it was checked time and time again. And even though there are still strains of the disease in the world, we have not memorized a list of do's and don'ts to keep it at bay. Neither have we enacted endless mandates creating segregation. Mankind goes on, as always. It's our fear of an unknown future, an unknown cure, an unknown end, which so adversely affects our lives. It's the fear that drives us into our homes, away from our comrades, away from our support groups, and away from our hope. And it was the same 2,000 years ago when that small group faced the absolute worst of fears, and responded as we have responded today. On their way to the garden, the Lord said to the 11, "You will all fall away because of me this night. For it is written, I will strike down the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock shall be scattered." The threat was quite clear. Their body was going to be broken up. Their members would all go their own separate ways. They would have no great leader or even their companions to guide them through their fear. They would struggle through independently and alone. Of course, we all remember Peter's great denial. And by his denial, I'm not referring to the 3 times in the wee hours of the morning when he told various individuals that he did not know Jesus. I'm referring to the denial which came immediately on the heels of the Lord's warning. Just 2 verses after our Lord's warning, we read, "But Peter said to him, even though all may fall away because of you, I will never fall away." And that's truly a great denial. It's a denial of fear. It's a denial of panic. It's a denial of self. Peter claims boldly and clearly that he is willing to stick it out even should everyone else flee. Peter knows what it means to stand pat, and he claims that he's going to do exactly that. Isn't it amazing, though, what just a little bit of fear can do to a life? It interrupts our most noble traits. It paralyzes our best intentions. It burns our hearts, our faces, and our souls with shame. It causes us to utter words we would never have believed could come out of our mouths. A little bit of fear is a powerful, powerful thing. And then he, that's Peter, began to curse and swear, "I do not know the man." You know, I love the word curse. It's not cursing as we tend to define it in the church. It comes from the root to lay down. And so, in effect, Peter is laying down the law. He is stating his denial in absolutely no uncertain terms. He made his position unequivocally clear. He did not know the man. And the same can be said of his swearing. For swear is not the word by which we tend to define it in the church either. His swearing is the making of an oath. He is promising, as we would in court, that what he is saying is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. He did not know the man. Look at what a little fear has done to even the foremost of the 12. Look at how fear has closed the mouth of the one who had been given the keys to the kingdom. Consider how fear has silenced the man who will preach the Pentecostal sermon and be the first to preach to a Gentile household. Consider how a little fear can undo even the boldest of proclamations and assertions. Which brings us to our second lesson about fear. Fear is isolating in the face of the unknown. You know, our primary response to COVID-19, the call of the day, has been social distancing. Stay away from everyone else. Keep your distance. Remove yourself from the risk. Avoid potential contamination. It certainly makes sense to avoid those who are infected. It seems to be the logical step in stopping the virus in its tracks. After all, we reason if a virus can't find any additional host, it will eventually die out on its own. Such isolation is nothing new. Peter tried a very similar approach. We've already seen how his fear drove him to silence about his allegiance. We've already seen how fear has driven him to say things he would not ordinarily believe himself capable of saying. But we must also consider how little fear has driven him away from all others and driven him into isolation, where he has only his own thoughts for company. And he went out and wept bitterly. You know, that's not a very impressive end to a sad day. It was a day that started gloriously. Peter and John had been responsible for the arrangements for the Passover, and they prepared everything as it was needed to be prepared for such an important feast. The disciples had all looked forward to the Passover with the Lord. They expected lessons from the Lord. They would have longed to share in such a celebration, in such a remembrance of what God could do in the lives of the Israelites. They would have felt community beyond the everyday affairs. And in a like manner, our Lord had also looked forward to this time with them, though for different reasons. In Luke's Gospel, we read, they left and found everything just as he had told them, and they prepared the Passover. And when the hour had come, he reclined at the table, and the apostles with him. And he said to them, I have earnestly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. It's the Lord's last hurrah with his men. It's the last chance he's going to have to share with them before they face the abomination that will come on Friday. It's his last chance to give them what they need to get through the 3 days of misery. It's his last chance. And he's looking forward to making the most of it. But sadly, as the Lord takes his first steps toward the Via Dolorosa, the victory was overshadowed by the bitterness reaped through fear. Even Peter, the foremost of the 12, knows only enough that he does not want to be a part of what is happening to the Lord. Our third lesson about fear is fear never moves us forward. Fear simply does not move us in a progressive way. Fear simply locks us in. We find it more and more difficult to extricate ourselves from our fears, for a new fear also looms on the horizon. And as we recalled last week, our protective measures are having detrimental effects on other critical aspects of our lives. Our economy has come to a screeching halt. More and more people are out of work. Our unemployment, which was under 4% at the end of 2019, is currently over 13%. School activities and other social events have been postponed or canceled. Churches are using impersonal video feeds to proclaim the word. Businesses are shuttered or struggling. Even doctors, the healers of the sick, are encouraging patients to call in or video conference their concerns. The only people that seem to be doing well from the stay-at-home mandate I heard this week was on a radio show. A personality was interviewing a guest, and the guest made the comment that the only people this stay-at-home mandate will help are the divorce lawyers. They expect a 23% increase in revenues when this is all done. You see, being locked in does not promote healthy relationships. Look at your average prison. It only prevents us from talking over real problems and concerns and being intimate. Being locked in does not promote new ideas and hopes. It only forces us to dwell on our isolation. And so it was with the disciples. The Lord had been taken. He'd faced 5 sham trials. He was cruelly tortured and ultimately executed. And now their leader was gone. Their future was equally uncertain. Fear and isolation were all the disciples had left. And then early in the morning, after 3 days of torment, Mary approaches the house where John and Peter are staying. Already we should note the scattering of the sheep, as the other 9 are not with them. In panic, Mary tells of the stone being rolled away and the missing body. And then we can almost allow their worst fears to become ours as we read. So Peter and the other disciple went forth, and they were going to the tomb. The two were running together, and the other disciple ran faster than Peter and came to the tomb first. And initially, we might believe that the two were racing to the tomb to find the resurrected Lord, but their fears prevent such hopes from surfacing. They were running to confirm only that the tomb has been disturbed, only that Mary's words were truthful, only that the body was truly gone. And we know that because in the next few verses we read, and so Simon Peter also came, following him, and entered the tomb. And he saw the linen wrappings lying there, and the face cloth which had been on his head, not lying with the linen wrappings, but rolled up in a place by itself. And so the other disciple who had first come to the tomb then also entered, and he saw and believed. For as yet they did not understand the scripture, that he must rise again from the dead. And so the disciples went away again to their own homes. You know, I love that verse. So the other disciple who had first come to the tomb then also entered, and he saw and believed. I love that verse because it seems to say that Peter did not. Peter saw, but he couldn't process it. Peter saw, but he couldn't make it a part of his heart and soul. Peter saw, but only with his eyes. Fear has paralyzed Peter's hope. It prevents even his thought processes from moving forward. It carries him back to the place he's been before. The wondrous was right before him, and yet his fear prevented his mind from processing the meaning of those things before him. And how many times do we come to the tombs of our lives with that same kind of fear? How many times must we see the hand of God before we recognize his hand in everything? How many times do we fear and hold back when we should be racing forward? How many times are we overcome by fear rather than overcoming fear and pressing on? And so finally, fear is put aside by faith. You know, there are a lot of fears in this world. If it wasn't COVID-19, it'd be something else. Life on a broken planet amid broken men is uncertain at best. It's that uncertainty from which fear springs forth. We fear not having the money we need to survive, or not having the money we need to retire, or not having the money we need for college education for our kids, or not having the money we need for whatever. We fear the loss of our health. We fear the process of aging. We fear the avarice of man. We fear the future and what it will hold. We fear that our past will come back to haunt us. We can fear a myriad of things. But in all of them, the only solution is found in the faith that fear is not the final determination of our lives. On Easter Sunday, we need to think about Paul's words to the Corinthians. They were written 3 decades after the small band of 12 had faced the very worst kind of fear. Worse than the Black Plague. Worse than COVID-19. They had faced the most abominable day in the face of human history. They had faced the saddest burial this world will ever know. They had grief that 200 million dead Europeans could not experience. Paul's words were written 3 decades after the disciples had turned the world upside down. Paul's words were written 3 decades after Peter was risen to his feet before a risen Lord. Paul writes, I make known to you, brethren, the gospel which I preached to you, which also you received, in which also you stand, by which also you are saved, if you hold fast the word which I preached to you. There's only one thing which can help us in overcoming fear, and that's faith. And that's so for three reasons. Faith is the only spark which can ignite hope. I make known to you, brethren, the gospel which I preached to you, which also you received. You know, especially in a world filled with bad news and doomsayers proclaiming only the worst, it takes something of a higher nature to spark true hope in our lives. You know, maybe we think that today's crisis calls for the hope of a cure for COVID-19. Sadly, mankind has not been successful in dealing with viruses. And so a cure is not probable in any near future. And if COVID-19 was wiped out tomorrow, some other infection of the soul would take place. Some other infection to drag us down, to depress us, to cause us anguish and frustration and worry. Financially, maybe a booming economy would offer us the hope we need. With blossoming investments and overflowing bank accounts, we could hope for a prosperous life. But just 2 months of warnings have eliminated much of that hope by decimating the savings of many Americans. Maybe we took hope in the end of the Cold War. But you know, battles still rage on. Wars are still being fought. Foes still appear amid those we believe to be allies. Some may take hope in all of our social media. Even as we're locked in our homes, we have digital ways to reach out and communicate. Unfortunately, we also see those same devices used as forms of abuse. This world simply cannot offer a lasting, viable hope which will spark the fire within our soul. And Paul understands that. The word Paul uses here for received has a more personal meaning than we typically associate with it. Paul is literally telling the Corinthians they took the gospel alongside their lives. It's not that you receive a gift and you lay it down. It's not that you get something and put it aside. It's not that you take something and forget about it, or that you grasp something only to grasp something else later. This reception is something that you take along. It goes for the ride. It's permanent, it's lasting, and it endures. The hope of the gospel has the power to journey with us and to stay with us no matter where we are or what we face. But not only is faith the spark which ignites hope, faith is the foundation of our lives. For it is in which also you stand. When all else in this life seems to become nothing more than a sinking quagmire, our faith offers the true bedrock of our lives. It alone offers that which will not be shaken by the events of this world. It alone offers that which will not be sunken. It alone offers that which is solid, secure, and a good footing. You know, a small group of fearful, scattered men became almost mercenary in their approach to the truth of an empty tomb. Men will not knowingly die for a lie. And yet every one of those men risked their lives to present the fact of the resurrection. Because they knew it was a foundation that could not be denied and would not crumble in the course of time. And Paul reminds his readers faith is the gateway to a better life. For it is by which you are saved. You know, we don't expect a miracle cure for COVID-19, nor do we anticipate that it will be the last crisis that man faces upon this earth. Creation is broken, man is broken. The only thing we have heard preached for the last 2 months is common sense. Stay at home if you're ill. Stay away from those who are ill. Wash your hands frequently to get rid of those ill airs that you bring home with you. Don't touch the mucous membranes of your nose, mouth, and eyes. And we hope that those common sense measures will offer us a path to continue to good health and to getting beyond the current crisis. And Paul reminds us that the path to heaven is found in that same kind of reality, but the path to eternity is entered through only one miracle step. We're not saved by an inoculation or social distancing. We're not saved by wearing a mask or gloves. We are saved by the sacrifice of one who has proven himself to be God's Son. As we said last week, that does not mean no believer will ever contract the coronavirus, even during the Black Death. Many of the monasteries were decimated because it was the church who saw to the care of the ill. But nor does it mean that life will always be a pleasant experience in which all our wants and wishes are to be fulfilled. It gives us a foundation upon which to stand, a hope in which to glory, and a love in which to revel. It doesn't mean that in the worst of times we have anything to fear. For we can take heart in the fact that this life is not the end all of life. This life is but an introduction to the one who offers us eternal life. Because the resurrection of the Son should give us hope for a resurrection after death. And it should give us a resurrection of spirit, even in this life. The resurrection is the spark which should drive our souls to flame, to burn brightly for Him, and to be His. You know, this week I was listening again to Don Francisco's classic, He's Alive. The song represents Peter's view of the crucifixion and the resurrection. And whenever I listen, I can almost hear Peter's anguish in the words. I can empathize with what Peter's feeling. Back inside the house again, the guilt and the anguish came. Everything I'd promised him just added to my shame. When at last it came to choices, I denied I knew his name. Even if he was alive, it wouldn't be the same. You know, since my college days, I've probably listened to that song hundreds, if not thousands of times. For a while, I listened to it every Easter. I also listen to it throughout the year. It's one of my favorite songs. Not just favorite religious songs, it's just one of my favorite songs. It's a song that just touches me whenever I hear it. And as I listen, I have always taken the words the way in which they were probably meant to be heard. Peter's grief, his anguish, his heartache, his guilt, his fear, his shame, make him realize there's absolutely no turning back. Things will never be like they were before his failure. He knows he will never be able to face the Lord, let alone stand before him. He's denied his allegiance. He's denied his love. He's denied his God. After all his promises, his bravado, his assertions, he has been forced to recognize the reality of his own weakness. Even if he was alive, it wouldn't be the same. This week, as I listened to the song again, I had another realization about those words. Maybe it was because I had it online and the lyrics were written there beside the song, and I could read the words without hearing the impassioned, emotional impact of the tone. But for whatever the reason, it suddenly occurred to me that Don Francisco was right. If Christ is alive, things will never be the same. If he's resurrected from the dead, if he has stepped forth from the tomb, if the crucifixion was only a momentary pause to his life, things will never be the same. If he's alive, everything changes. If he's alive, death no longer holds any fear. If he's alive, we're forgiven. If he's alive, it will never be the same. You know, we don't know what the future will look like because of COVID-19. But that shouldn't be the big concern in our lives. Because we do know that we have the power for overcoming fear because of one glorious Sunday 2,000 years ago. News of his resurrection has given the spark to go on when times are tough. News of his resurrection has offered us the foundation upon which we must stand for all of our lives and for all eternity. News of his resurrection has opened a gateway to an eternity we might otherwise never hope to receive. We can empathize with Peter and realize that because he's alive, nothing will ever be the same. May we remember that not just on Easter,